Well, hey there. I'm your host for today's March Madness bracket. I'm Jeff Hyman. I will be honest with you. I know about as much about basketball as, I can't even imagine. Maybe my mom. And it's just never been something that I have been into. But March Madness and the bracket just inspired me to create this video for you. And I think you're going to get a ton out of it. I call it the mishire madness. And the reason I call it mishire madness is we all make bad hires. We've all made mishires. I'm sure you have too. And so whether you're trying to figure out what happened, what did you miss, or maybe you're interviewing and assessing a candidate right now and you want to make sure you get it right, no matter what, this video is for you and really going to help you. And so what we've done is taken the top 16 ways that I have seen people assess a candidate. And I've been at this for 25 years. And I just made a list of those 16. And today we're actually going to do the actual playoffs, and we're going to get to the final criteria. And I guarantee it's going to surprise you. The one thing that you should be looking at more than anything else. So why don't we get into it, and why don't we start the bracket? And first I want to start with kind of what are those 16 criteria. And by the way, if you stick around to the end, I'm going to give you my email address, and you can actually get a copy of this and stick it on your wall. Okay, so industry experience, right? This is probably the most common one in my 25 years of recruiting. Find me someone who's got 10 years of industry experience. And I get it, right? I understand there's an assumption that if someone has worked in the industry, in your industry, well, they're going to come on board and they're going to ramp faster. They're going to know the lingo. They're going to know the customers. If they're in sales, they're going to bring their whole book of business. And sure, that kind of makes sense. And it's a great nice to have. But should it be a must have? You're going to dramatically reduce the number of candidates that you can talk to. And studies show that it's actually not a great predictor of success. Look at it this way. What if that candidate worked at a company that has a lot of bad habits and really poor training, and they just happen to be in your industry, but they're going about it the wrong way? Or maybe they're in your industry, but they're positioned completely differently, right? They're a low-cost provider, and you're a high-service provider. You're a premium provider. Your two companies couldn't be more different. So we're going to talk about that. Years of experience. This is a similar one. I've heard this over the years. Find me someone with 5 to 10 years or 10 to 20 years. The other day I had a client say they wanted someone with 4 to 6 years of experience. To which I said, well, if we find the perfect person and they had 3 years or 7 years, you don't want to talk to them? And of course my client says, yeah, we would talk to them. And so you really want to be careful on years of experience, and we'll get to that in a bit. Previous work achievements, right? What has the person delivered in their previous roles? Did they make it happen? Did the trains run on time? Did they hit their numbers? Did they create that amazing marketing campaign? So that's a clear factor to consider. Okay, GPA and SAT scores, or GMAT scores, or JD scores, any kind of standardized test. I still hear this today. Many of my clients say, I only want someone from a top school who got a 3.9 or better. In fact, Google for many, many years looked at GPA, and which explains why I never worked at Google. So that's a factor. Okay, let's go to number 5, the test drive. What is a test drive? A test drive is a way of assessing a candidate based on them actually doing the work. So late in the process, you set up a time, and it could be in person, it could be online, whatever. It could be a take-home project, maybe in a software developer role. And you work with that person side by side for 2-3 hours, half a day, a full day, whatever you and they can muster. And I'll be honest, sometimes that's at night or on the weekends, whenever the candidate can make the time. But a test drive gives you a real inside look into how they do the role, not just them telling you how they would do the role. And so we'll talk about that. 360 ratings. Okay, 360 ratings. How did other people around the candidate rate them? I have clients that still want to hire someone based on 360 ratings. They want someone that will get along with others or play nicely. And I get that goal, but studies have shown that over time, 360 ratings can be quite misleading because you have all kinds of noise in there, right? jealousy, envy. Perhaps someone was promoted over someone that was a peer, and so in the 360 ratings, they throw them under the bus. Perhaps they didn't get along with their manager, but the manager was a nut job, and so you just don't know the whole context, and so it is very, very dangerous to rely on 360 ratings. References that are provided by the candidate. So I'm sure you've checked references, maybe you've given a list of references before, and those are provided references. From a candidate, it would seem like that's a pretty good source of information. As are backdoor references, right? So backdoor references are different. These are references we look up on our own. We use LinkedIn and other kind of referral networks and asking, do you happen to know Charlie, or who else knows Charlie? People that Charlie didn't give me, and checking those references. So we'll touch base on that in a minute. Okay, let's go to number 9. Unstructured interviews. These are your typical job interview. So tell me about yourself. These are the interviews where the hiring manager hasn't spent a second preparing for it, has not even looked at the resume in advance, and is kind of all over the place. But it's an interview, so it's an unstructured interview. The resume, candidate's resume, or maybe these days their LinkedIn profile or some kind of document. That's something that all too many people make a hiring decision from. Then there's structured interviews, right? So these are similar to the other one, but these are well thought through, very methodical, asking the same question of every candidate over and over so we can form patterns and evaluate that way. Leadership. Who doesn't want leadership skills, no matter what role, not just the CEO, but a department head, a department manager, maybe even an individual contributor who might become a leader one day. Perhaps leadership would be important. A writing sample. A lot of clients say to me, I don't want to hire anyone unless they can write beautifully. And I totally get that for a copywriter position. I don't necessarily get that for some other roles, but that's a factor some people will look at, as is DNA. So what's DNA? DNA, psychologists have figured out that we as people are pretty hardwired by the time we're 8 years old. And if you have young kids, you know this, right? If you're going to be funny or musical or detail-oriented or a slob or whatever it may be, you're pretty hard-baked by the time you're 8. And barring any kind of life-changing trauma, that's the person you're going to become. And so DNA are these deep-seated, hardwired tendencies of how someone behaves. That's all it is. And it's very much like other DNA, like physical DNA, how tall you're going to be, your eye color, etc. Okay, level of interest in the role. That's something that might make sense as an evaluation criteria for a candidate. How interested are they in actually doing the job? And then quality of school. So I want someone from a top 10 school or a top 20 school, except for this one or that one because our CEO doesn't like that school. I get that one all the time. Okay, so here's our bracket. We're going to have a lot of fun right now because we're going to actually go through these 16 factors, and I call it March Madness, but it's Miss-Hire Madness because I'm going to help you avoid the bad hires. And the way we're going to do this is figure out of the 2 criteria which one is the more reliable way to predict how the candidate will perform on the job. That's the question we're asking. That's the $1 million question. I'm trying to find a predictor of how will this person deliver and perform on the job every day, day after day. And you can play along at home. So let's start with the first bracket. Industry experience versus years of experience. Well, industry experience, as I mentioned, is useful, on the margin. If someone knows the business and the industry, they should ramp faster. How long they've been at it, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, a little less predictive. I will tell you that I've read every study that I've seen that I can get my hands on, I've read and dissected to understand based on objective evaluation and back testing what are the most predictive things. And in this particular case, it's industry experience, just by a hair. But if you've got all else being equal, someone with a little bit more experience, someone with a little less experience, but they're from the industry experience is a helpful predictor of how they're going to do in the role. But again, nice to have, not must have. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next pairing is previous work achievements versus GPA and SAT scores. Well, this one is a little bit easier because it turns out GPA and SAT scores are really not a very good predictor. For starters, a lot of very successful people dropped out of school altogether. So there you go. You know, your Mark Zuckerbergs and Steve Jobs of the world. But even then, people that are super smart and even just great test takers aren't necessarily well suited for the role that you're hiring. And so relying on just a simple objective measure, although it might be simple or it might be easy, it's actually not the way to go. Previous work experiences or achievements are the way to go. Okay, let's go to the next pairing. The test drive, which I explained what that was, versus 360 ratings. Also a pretty even or easy pairing. Test drive by a long shot. If I can see someone in action actually doing the job versus hearing how they did the job from other peers and bosses and subordinates, some of whom may have an axe to grind or some vested interest, or maybe even some animosity, that's an easy decision. We want to look at their test drive. So we are well into the final 8 now. Okay, let's go to the next one. I'm so geeked out and excited about this. Provided references versus backdoor references. Now, what do you think before I tell you which one I would go with? Yeah, so provided references are certainly easier to get. The candidate gives me or emails me a list of their provided references. You know how that goes. They give you 3 to 4 references. And that's good. You know, I actually look at that list and I pay attention to who's missing. I want to talk to each of their bosses from the past 4 jobs, with the exclusion of their current job if they're currently working, because obviously that, you know, would have a confidentiality issue. But if they can't give me their previous managers, that's a yellow flag. I want to understand why. And I tell the candidate, even if they're going to be bad references, I want to talk to them. I want to understand where was the disconnect, where was the misfit, to make sure that doesn't happen this time. But as it turns out, backdoor references clobber provided references, because now I'm talking to people that aren't on the script, right? They haven't been briefed or pre-briefed by the candidate. They can give me their candid thoughts without worrying about being revealed, etc. And they're super easy to track down. I've made a whole video separately on how to do that. It just takes a few minutes of your time. Talking to backdoor references is a great predictor of how someone's going to do on the job. Okay, let's go to the next pairing, which is unstructured interviews, which would seem to be all over the place, as so many interviews are, especially on Zoom. Or a candidate's resume or a LinkedIn profile. Well, this may surprise you, but turns out unstructured interviews are still pretty good. A resume or a LinkedIn profile is nothing but a sales brochure. It's largely useless. In fact, I don't use them for anything other than to tell me if this candidate is worth investing some time. And I usually start with a 15-minute phone screen, and then I progress to a 1-hour interview and then a 2 or 3 hour interview after that. But resumes and LinkedIn profiles after that are largely useless. So I'm going to go with unstructured interviews, and the data actually says that unstructured interviews are somewhat predictive of how a candidate will do in the job. But there are some better ones, and we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, now structured interviews versus leadership. So structured interviews are very methodical, right? I'm asking the same questions over and over of each candidate. I'm taking careful notes. I'm preparing. That is a structured interview. It's a well-done interview. Probably 10% of interviewers actually do it that way. And then there's leadership skills, right? Well, who doesn't like leadership skills? We all want to be a leader, or maybe. And regardless of the role I'm hiring for, you could argue that leadership skills are important. And hey, leaders are born, not made. So if I find one, maybe I should hire them. Well, as it turns out, leadership skills are a useful predictor, but not in every case. It depends a lot on the role, the career path, the particular culture. Is it a kind of a consensus culture or a command and control culture? Is it a turnaround situation versus a growth situation? So leadership skills are useful, great to have. Who doesn't want that? But not always a great predictor for this particular role and this particular situation. Turns out structured interviews are a much better predictor of how the person will do on the job. And I don't believe that leadership skills cannot be learned and gained over time. A great manager can teach leadership skills, mentor an employee, put them in situations where they have an opportunity to develop their leadership skills. But if someone bombs structured interviews, that's a pretty good predictor that it's important to keep looking for the next candidate. Okay, let's go to the final set of brackets. We're closing in now on the final four. Writing sample versus DNA. Pretty easy. Writing sample, okay. I guess if you're a copywriter, I don't care too much about other stuff, unless you're just an amazing writer. DNA clobbers it all day long, right? If I can understand how someone is hardwired, are they detail-oriented? Are they humorous? Are they high attention to detail? Those are things that I'm not going to have to babysit and micromanage day after day after day, trying to make someone into those things when they're never going to become those things because they're not hardwired. And, there's a lot of debate on whether that's nature, nurture, whatever it may be. Psychologists, and this is based on a lot of research that I've studied, say that around age 8, you're kind of done. And so that's better than a writing sample for me. Okay, the last pairing. Level of interest in the job versus the quality of the school they went to. That's a close call. Turns out they're both pretty useless, but level of interest is a little more useful in predicting how someone's going to do on the job, because if they're more engaged and more passionate about your industry and your company and the role, they're more likely to engage in the work at hand and the task at hand. And I'll take that all day long, right? I can teach them other skills they might be missing, but it's very hard to motivate someone if they're just not that interested. So level of interest, if it's genuine, and you can assess that in a candidate, why are you interested? Not just, I'm interested. Quality of school, largely useless, right? And this is coming from a guy who was fortunate enough to go to some pretty good schools. Went to an Ivy League school. I went to a top 10 business school. Those are wonderful. There are plenty of people in my class that I wouldn't hire for a given role, right? Not because they're bad people, but they're just a bad match with the particular role, just like I would be or you would be, right? So quality of school, I think, is often misleading, right? People look at it as a weeding out factor. Again, they're looking for a shortcut. If someone went to a top 10 school or an Ivy League school or a West Coast school, then they must be blank. And I guess that's somewhat useful, but really not a very good predictor. Not as good as level of interest. Okay, we are down to the final four bracket. We're making headway, okay? Let's get going. So between industry experience and previous work experience, you could probably guess what I was going to say. Previous work achievements, which is different than previous work experience. Previous work achievements, seeing that the guy or gal crushed it in role after role after role, and how they did it, and drilling into it during the interviews and the reference checks to find out, were they lucky or were they good, right? If they were in sales and they made President's Club, I want to know, did they build a pipeline and methodically prosecute that pipeline and close 17% of their leads, or did they get one whale that happened to land in their lap just as the previous sales rep was on their way out? So you really need to drill into, how was that achievement created? But it is a good predictor of how the person's going to do in your job. It's like a stock chart, right? Stock chart's going up, tends to go up. Stock chart's going down, it's like catching a falling knife. Okay, let's go to the next pairing. Test drive versus backdoor references. This one's actually pretty tough. This would be like me choosing between my two favorite children. Got to go with test drive. You got to go with test drive. Test drive every time is going to be a great predictor. Backdoor references, time consuming, really useful, way more useful than frontdoor references. But if I had to choose my own eyes and experience with a candidate for half a day, when I can see them in action, see how they work, are they going to be annoying and distracting to the organization? How do they think through a problem? And again, I've done videos on how to structure a test drive effectively, because you can certainly screw it up. But it turns out to be a great predictor. Okay, let's go to the next pairing, which is unstructured interviews versus structured interviews. You can probably guess it's going to be structured interviews, although not by as much of a difference as you might think. The research says that certainly structured interviews are better, but unstructured interviews, even if you don't know what you're doing and you meet and do your best. Even if you ask the wrong questions, it's still decent. And I've done videos on the right questions to ask, and you can get a free copy of my book if you want, which will give you all the questions to ask. It turns out it's actually not the questions you ask. It's asking the same questions over and over so that you can develop patterns and understand both how a career trajectory went over time and then how that person's career trajectory compared to other candidates. It's not asking some magical question. Okay, the last one, the last bracket to the final four is DNA, right? I probably sold you on that before. If you're not convinced by now, I don't know what to tell you, but DNA, way better predictor than someone's level of interest. Level of interest is good, but if I know how someone's hardwired, how they're going to behave, I can actually predict their behavior once they're on the job, once they're in the seat. So now we got four really tough contenders here. There's been a couple of upsets. We're down to the final four. I hope you're ready. I hope you have placed your wagers. Let's get to it. The first pairing is previous work achievements, how the person did in the job after job, consistently. They made President's Club. They were top performer. They got amazing ratings. They launched new products. They brought in new revenue streams. They killed it job after job after job. Versus the test drive, right? I'm seeing them in action, and we're working together on a real-world project that I've carefully created about our business. And even if I have to pay them for their time, I'm spending 2 hours, 4 hours, maybe a whole day. I've seen companies spend a whole week with a candidate, as much time as you can, to avoid making a mishire. Which one of those two do you think would be a better predictor? Well, it turns out that the studies, and I'm happy to send you these studies, and man, they are boring. They will put you to sleep. Turns out the test drive is better, right? It's great that they were in those situations and that they did well, but I'm actually now seeing the person deliver right there in front of me with my own eyes. And I'm also doing a test drive with other candidates, so I'm comparing the two, comparing and contrasting. Great, they did well in the past, but this person crushed the test drive. Better predictor. And again, science validates that, as does my experience with a lot of recruiting. Okay, final one. Structured interviews, right? Sitting down, same interview over and over and over with every candidate versus DNA. How is someone hardwired? And in the other videos that I've got on this channel, we talk about how to assess DNA, right? Because there's no written test for that, but it's actually easier than you might think to understand. So it turns out that DNA is the better predictor. So how someone is hardwired is more accurate than structured interviews. People lie in interviews. 71% of your candidates are lying to your face in the interview. They can have a good day. They can have a bad day. Some people are just nervous. They just have bad interview anxiety and a wet handshake. So or a bad Zoom connection. And so if I had to pick one between those two, it would be the DNA. Okay, so now we're at the final two. We're down to the ultimate head off. It's nighttime. We got our popcorn. We got our beer. We've placed our bet. We've disconnected from the world, and we're going to watch the game. And here's the game. I'm going to tell you the answer right now, but first I want you to tell me, is it the test drive, working with the candidate, the finalist candidate, for 2 hours, 4 hours, for a day, whatever you can, on a real-world project? Or is it DNA, how that candidate has been hardwired and brought up through life and how they've kind of evolved? And that doesn't mean education, that doesn't mean their parenting, it just means their own natural evolution. Are they detail-oriented? Are they funny? Are they creative? Are they math-oriented? What is their gift in life, and have they even found it? Which of those two is a better predictor? I'm going to tell you that it's not by a huge margin. This one is a squeaker, folks. It's like 1 or 2 points difference. It's the DNA. The DNA every time. I talk about this in my book. I talk about this in the courses that I've taught. I teach this to my clients. If I can use one thing of all these 16 factors, the DNA is the single best predictor of how your candidate is going to do on the job. And think about it, right? Let's back test that. Think about the mishires that you've made over the years. And how many of those mishires were skills related, knowledge related versus how many were just hardcore how the person was wired related. Now, at the time, you probably said it was a culture fit, culture mismatch. Okay, I get it. But more likely, I would submit to you that it was how the person was hardwired. They were never wired from the beginning to be successful in the job that you hired them. Now, why did you hire them? Maybe you misread the DNA. Maybe you underestimated or overestimated. Maybe you were so desperate for a candidate that you settled, right? I mean, that happens to all of us. But more often than not, it's the DNA that drives a mismatch. And so I encourage you, if you take away nothing else from this video, to hold out for the candidate that has the right DNA for your particular organization. And every company has a different DNA, and for your particular role. And if you do those two things and find a person with the right DNA, you can teach them the rest. You can give them skills. You can send them to training. You can teach them leadership. You can't teach DNA. It just doesn't change. So I hope this was useful takeaway. Now, if you want to get a copy of this, I actually have it in a one sheet. You can print out the PDF and stick it on your wall. And every time you're assessing a candidate or racking your brains, what did I miss? You can refer to it. Just send me an email. It's Jeff, Jeff, at recruitrockstars.com. Jeff at recruitrockstars.com, and I'll send it to you. And hopefully you'll be winning a lot of championships. Take care.